Close your eyes for a moment. Just imagine you've just woken up. But you're not in your comfy bed surrounded by your pillows. Instead, you're on a pile of straw that smells faintly, and let's be honest, unpleasantly, of cow. Congratulations. You've just time traveled and you are now a serf in medieval England. Welcome to your new life. It's rustic. First things first, let's talk about ownership. You don't own the land you're standing on. You don't own the little mud and wattle hut you just woke up in. In fact, technically, you don't even own yourself. You are legally tied to the estate of your lord. This means if he decides to sell his land, you are part of the deal. You get sold right along with the fields, the trees, and the barns. Think of it like being livestock, but with the added bonus of having to pay rent. Your day starts long before the sun even thinks about rising. That rooster you hear crowing, he's late. He doesn't even have time to stretch his wings before you're already out in the fields, tools in hand. And whose land do you work first? Your own little garden patch to feed your family. Oh, no, you work the Lord's land first. It's called the domain, because heaven forbid the crops destined for the nobleman's fancy dinner table come second to the needs of your own starving family. The priority is clear, and it isn't you. After hours of backbreaking labor on the Lord's fields, you might get a chance to tend to your own small strip of land. This is where you grow the food that will hopefully get your family through the year. It's a constant race against time, against the weather, and against sheer exhaustion. You work from sunup to sundown every single day with only a few religious holidays off, and those holidays, they were probably spent doing extra chores around your hut anyway. So, after a long day of toil, what's for dinner? Let's take a look at the medieval serf's menu. Your meals are humble. They consist mostly of coarse, dark bread, often made from rye or barley because wheat was for the rich. Accompanying that is a bowl of pottage. Now, pottage is a sort of thick, soup-like stew made from whatever vegetables you could grow or find. Peas, beans, and root vegetables were common. And if you were lucky, really lucky, you might have a few onions or some herbs to spice it up. What about meat? For most serfs, meat was a rumor, a legend whispered by the elders. You might have a bit of bacon if you were fortunate enough to own a pig, but beef and lamb, that was strictly for the Lord's table. Now, let's get to everyone's favorite topic, taxes. You might think your taxes are high today, but a medieval serf would laugh at our complaints. You paid taxes to your lord, often in the form of labor or a portion of your own harvest. Then you paid a tithe to the church, which was 10% of everything you produced. And on top of that, you paid taxes to the king whenever he needed to fund a war or a new castle. That's right, triple taxation before you've even had breakfast. And what happens if you can't pay, or if you complain about the endless work and meager food? Well, the Lord has a court for that. You might get slapped with a fine, which is just a medieval way of saying, you're now even poorer than you were before. There was no real justice system for people like you. The Lord was the law, and his word was final. You couldn't leave the manor without his permission. You couldn't get married without his permission. Every aspect of your life was controlled. So, as the sun finally sets and you drag your aching body back to your straw bed, you know that tomorrow will be exactly the same. The same pre-dawn start, the same back-breaking labor, the same bland pottage, and the same constant struggle for survival. This was the reality for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe. It was a life of incredible hardship, but also one of resilience. These were the people whose tireless work built the foundations of the world we know today. It really makes you appreciate your pillow and your morning coffee, doesn't it? If you found this glimpse into the past fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. We've got so much more to explore together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Ever wondered what it was really like to be a peasant in medieval England? Forget the romanticized images of merry villagers dancing around a maypole. The reality was a relentless grind, a life dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the whims of a powerful lord. Let's step back in time and spend a day in their shoes. Your day starts before the sun even thinks about rising. You stumble out of your small, smoky hut, a one-room affair you probably share with your entire family and maybe a few animals for warmth. The air is cold, the dew soaks your thin clothes, and the mud clings to your legs. Forget a hearty breakfast. You're lucky if there's a stale crust of bread left from yesterday. Your stomach growls, but there's no time to think about that. The fields are waiting. Out in the Lord's vast open field, you find your tools. We're not talking about shiny modern machinery. You grab a heavy, clumsy wooden plow. If you're one of the more fortunate peasants, you might have a pair of oxen to help pull it. If not, well, you and a few others might be pulling it yourselves. And you're never truly alone. The Lord's overseer, known as the reeve, is always watching. Think of him as the medieval version of a micromanager, but instead of sending passive-aggressive emails, he carries a whip and isn't afraid to use it. There are no sick days, no coffee breaks, just the relentless task of turning over the heavy, damp soil, row after painstaking row. Your entire year is a cycle of backbreaking labor. After plowing comes sowing, scattering seeds by hand and praying for a good germination. Then comes the endless weeding under the hot summer sun, protecting the precious crops from being choked out. Finally, the harvest, a frantic race against time and weather to bring in the grain. You'll spend weeks swinging a scythe or sickle until your hands are blistered and your back feels like it's about to snap. Every sheaf of wheat, every bundle of barley has to be gathered, tied, and hauled to the Lord's barn. Remember, he gets the first and best portion of everything. It's called a tithe, and it's non-negotiable. What about lunch? You might get a short break in the middle of the day. You'll sit on the ground, wipe the sweat from your brow, and chew on another piece of dry, dark bread. If you're lucky, you might have a hunk of cheese or an onion to go with it. To wash it down, not water. The local streams and rivers were often contaminated, basically open sewers. So everyone, including children, drank what was known as small beer, a weak, low-alcohol ale. It was safer, provided some calories, and was probably the only comfort in a long, hard day. But the work isn't over when the sun begins to set. After you've finished toiling on the Lord's land, you still have your own patch to tend to. You and your family were typically granted a small strip of land to farm for yourselves. Of course, these were usually the worst plots, rocky, poorly drained, and far from your hut. This little strip was your lifeline. It had to produce enough food to get your family through the long, cold winter. The pressure was immense. A failed crop didn't just mean tightening your belt. It meant starvation. It could mean your children going hungry or worse. And if you were seen as failing, you could be accused of laziness and face eviction, leaving you with nothing. So, as night finally falls, you trudge back to your hut, your body screaming in protest. You eat a simple pottage of vegetables. If you have them, collapse onto a straw mattress and try to get a few hours of sleep before it all starts again. This wasn't a life of adventure or romance. It was a life of survival, resilience, and incredible hardship, lived day in and day out by millions of ordinary people whose labor built the foundations of the world we know today. Thank you so much for joining me on this trip back in time. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to explore. See you in the next video. Think your tax bill is a nightmare? Trust me, it's a walk in the park compared to what our ancestors in medieval England had to deal with. If your accountant saw their tax code, they'd probably pack up and move to a deserted island. Let's break down this financial horror story. First up, the basics, your rent. You're living on a lord's land, so naturally you owe him. But we're not talking about a simple bank transfer. Nope, you paid in what you had. That meant handing over a chunk of your hard-earned crops, a few of your precious chickens, or even days of your own back-breaking labor. Imagine your landlord accepting payment in potatoes and manual labor. It sounds absurd, but for a medieval serf, that was just another Tuesday. You'd spend days plowing his fields, harvesting his crops, or mending his fences, all before you could even start working for your own family. But the fun doesn't stop there. Just when you think you've settled up with the Lord, another knock comes on your door. This time it's the church, and they've come for their tithe. The word literally means a tenth, and they took it very, very seriously. A tenth of what, you ask? A tenth of everything. Your grain, your wool, your newborn lambs, even the eggs your chickens laid. That's right, every 10th egg was technically God's egg. They kept meticulous records, so there was no hiding that extra bushel of wheat. It was a divine audit, and you did not want to fail it. Now, what happens if you have a bad year? A drought hits, your crops fail, and your livestock gets sick? You can't pay the Lord, and you can't pay the church. Do they offer a payment plan? Maybe some medieval tax relief? Not exactly. If you couldn't pay up, the consequences were severe. They could take your most valuable possessions. That might be your best plow, the tools you needed to work, or even your only ox, the medieval equivalent of repossessing your car and your entire toolbox. Without them, how could you possibly earn enough to pay next year's taxes? It was a vicious cycle. In some cases, you'd be forced into something called debt labor. This meant you had to work extra days on the Lord's land, completely unpaid, just to settle your debt. It was a trap that was incredibly difficult to escape from, ensuring that many families remained tied to the same piece of land, in the same state of poverty, for generations. And just when you think they couldn't possibly tax anything else, you find out they've monetized every major life event. Getting married? There's a fee for that, payable to the Lord for his permission. Having a child baptized? The priest needs his cut? Even dying wasn't free. Yes, you heard me correctly. You had to pay to die. When someone passed away, the family had to give the Lord their best animal or piece of clothing as a heriot or death tax. It was the ultimate insult. You work your entire life, and even in death, they find a way to bill you. So, next time you're grumbling about filing your tax return, just take a moment to be grateful. At least you don't have to give the government every 10th egg your backyard chickens lay. The system might not be perfect, but it's a world away from medieval England, where the only things certain in life were death and a whole lot of taxes. If you found this trip back in time interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Have you ever felt stuck in a job you can't stand with a boss who seems to own your soul? Well, let me take you back in time to an era where that feeling was the reality for almost everyone. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where your life wasn't just a job. It was a sentence, and your boss was a lord who literally owned you. Imagine a giant pyramid. At the very top, you've got the king chilling in his castle. Below him are the powerful nobles, the dukes and barons, who got huge chunks of land from the king. And then, way down at the dusty, muddy, forgotten bottom, that's where you are. A serf. Congratulations, you're the foundation holding up this entire glittering structure, and your reward is basically just not getting crushed. Let's talk about your day-to-day. You live on your lord's land in a little hut that's probably more mud than wood. That small plot of land you farm to feed your family. It's not really yours. It's on loan from the Lord, and the rent is steep. You don't pay with money because what's money? You pay with your sweat, your time, and your energy. The Lord could wake up one morning and decide his castle needs a new wall. Guess who's hauling the stones? You. His fields need plowing before his own crops are planted. Guess who's yoking the ox? You. His daughter is getting married and he wants a feast fit for a king. You're not just providing the food from your harvest. You're probably building the tables, serving the wine, and cleaning up the mess afterwards. And what if you said no? What if you told the Lord, sorry, my own fields are dying and my family is hungry. I can't help you today. That would be a very, very bad idea. Saying no wasn't an option? Refusing the Lord's command could get you thrown into a dark, damp dungeon. He could impose a massive fine that you could never hope to pay, or worse. He could just take away that little plot of land your family depends on, effectively leaving you to starve. You were trapped with nowhere to go. You couldn't just pack up and move to a neighboring town for a better opportunity. You were legally tied to the land almost like a piece of furniture. Now you might think, okay, the Lord is terrible, but surely there's some other power, some moral authority to appeal to. Let's talk about the church. In the Middle Ages, the church was arguably even more powerful than the king. Its influence was absolute, and its message was everywhere. From the moment you were born to the moment you died, religion was the operating system of your life. But if you were hoping the church would side with the common person, you'd be disappointed. Priests and bishops were often wealthy landowners themselves, part of the same elite class as the lords. They preached a message that was incredibly convenient for those in power. They'd stand at the pulpit and tell you that your suffering, your poverty, and your endless labor were all part of God's divine plan. This life is a test, they'd say. Your hardship is designed to purify your soul. Endure it with humility, and your reward will be eternal bliss in heaven. It was a brilliant strategy. It reframed your oppression as a holy duty. Don't complain about your Lord. He was chosen by God to rule over you. Don't question your place in life. It was divinely ordained. Keep your head down, keep working, and look forward to your prize after you're dead. The subtext was clear. Don't rock the boat. Keep digging. This created a powerful psychological cage. It wasn't just the Lord's guards you had to worry about. It was the fear of eternal damnation. If you disobeyed your Lord, you weren't just committing a crime against him. You were committing a sin against God. The entire system was a masterpiece of control, a perfect fusion of physical force and spiritual fear. The Lord had the sword, and the church had the keys to heaven. Together, they ensured that the pyramid stayed standing, with you firmly and obediently at the bottom. It was a system designed for one thing: obedience, powered by the constant, chilling fear of punishment in this life and the next. So, the next time you feel like complaining about your 9-to-5, just take a moment to appreciate that you can actually quit. It's a small freedom, but one that your medieval ancestors could only dream of. Thanks for journeying back in time with me. If you found this interesting, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. See you in the next one. Have you ever binge-watched a fantasy show and thought, wow, living in medieval times would be so romantic? All those grand castles, epic feasts, and chivalrous knights? Well, let me pull back the curtain on that fantasy for a moment. For about 90% of the population, life wasn't a fairy tale. It was dirty, smelly, and incredibly tough. So grab your popcorn and let's take a tour of a real medieval home. I promise you'll be grateful for your modern apartment by the end. First, let's talk about building materials. Forget elegant stonework or sturdy oak beams. Your dream home was a humble hut, constructed from what was freely available, wattle and daub. That's a fancy way of saying a framework of woven sticks, plastered over with a delightful mixture of mud, straw, clay, and animal manure. Yes, you heard that right. You literally lived inside a wall of poop. It was a great insulator, apparently, but let's just imagine the smell on a hot summer day. And the roof? It was typically thatched with straw or reeds. While it looked rustic and charming, it was basically a leaky sponge. Rain would drip through, turning your floor into a muddy mess. It was also a cozy home for rats, mice, and all sorts of insects who would occasionally drop down to say hello. There was no guttering, so the ground around your house was a permanent swamp. Oh, and these thatched roofs were incredibly flammable. A stray spark from your fire, and your entire life could go up in smoke in minutes. Step inside if you dare. Mind your head, doorways were low, and what's under your feet? Not polished floorboards, not even flagstones. Just packed earth. The same dirt from outside was now inside. It was cold, damp, and when it rained it turned to mud. To keep things slightly less miserable, people would strew straw or rushes on the floor, but this rarely got changed. It just accumulated layers of spilled food, animal waste, and general filth, becoming a breeding ground for fleas and disease. Now, let's look around your one-room palace. The whole family, parents, kids, maybe some grandparents lived, slept, and ate in this single small space, and you weren't alone. To protect them from thieves and the cold, you'd bring your precious livestock inside at night. Chickens, a goat, maybe even the family pig would be your roommates. They provided a little extra warmth, but they also added to the noise, the mess, and the unforgettable aroma. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. So where do you cook? Right in the middle of the room on an open hearth. But wait, where's the chimney? Spoiler alert, there isn't one. Just a hole in the roof to let some asterisk of the smoke out. The inside of the hut would be constantly filled with thick, stinging smoke. This led to chronic eye infections and respiratory problems. It's no wonder the walls and ceiling were permanently blackened with soot. And what about furniture? Luxuries were few and far between. You might have a rough wooden bench to sit on, maybe a simple trestle table that could be taken down to make space. For sleeping, the entire family would pile onto a single mattress, which was just a sack stuffed with straw, hay, or even dead leaves. This mattress, lying on the damp floor, was often crawling with lice and other pests. Your pillow? Probably a log or a pile of rags. Finally, let's talk about personal hygiene, or the lack thereof. You'd be lucky to have a full wash once a year. Your water source was the nearest river or stream, the same place everyone else got their water, washed their clothes, and dumped their waste. So, waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were rampant. As for the toilet, it was either a pot in the corner that got emptied outside, or just a designated spot in the nearby bush. The stench of medieval villages is something we can barely comprehend today. So, the next time you re-complaining about your Wi-Fi being a bit slow or your roommate leaving dishes in the sink, just take a moment. Picture your medieval peasant ancestor huddling for warmth next to a pig in a smoky, manure-walled hut, hoping the roof doesn't collapse. Puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Thanks so much for joining me on this rather grimy trip back in time. If you enjoyed this and want to see more historical realities, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time. Did you think love was a free choice? Think again, especially if you were a serf in the Middle Ages. If you wanted to get married, you had to get permission from your lord. And guess what? He often charged a fee for the privilege. It was like a medieval marriage tax. Want to marry someone from a neighboring village? That was even more complicated and expensive. See, in the eyes of the Lord, you were his property. If you married someone from another manor, it was like a valuable asset leaving his estate. He wasn't just going to let that happen for free. So that happily ever after came with a hefty price tag, and it wasn't even your choice to pay it. Now, imagine starting a family under these conditions. Your children were born into the exact same life, the same inescapable cycle. There was no bright future to dream of for them, no hope of them becoming a doctor or a scholar. From the tender age of 6 or 7, their childhood was over. They weren't in a classroom. They were out in the fields, right alongside you. Their first jobs were things like scaring crows away from the precious crops or hauling heavy buckets of water. It was a life of hard labor from the moment they could walk steadily. This wasn't about teaching them a work ethic. It was about pure survival. Every extra pair of hands, no matter how small, was needed to meet the Lord's demands and keep the family from starving. What about school and education? Forget about it. For a serf, formal learning was a fantasy. The only real path to education was through the church by becoming a monk or a priest. But let's be realistic. That was an incredibly difficult and rare opportunity, practically impossible for the average serf family to achieve. The church was its own powerful institution, and it wasn't exactly holding open-door admissions for the children of field workers. So, literacy, mathematics, philosophy, these were concepts from another universe. Your world was the soil, the seasons, and the relentless rhythm of agricultural life. Knowledge was passed down, but it was practical knowledge: when to plant, how to mend a fence, how to please the Lord. The world of books and ideas was locked away. So you were trapped. Your spouse was trapped. Your children were born into the same trap. Every single day was a repeat of the last. Wake up at dawn, work the land until dusk, hand over most of what you produced, and collapse into bed, exhausted. It was a muddy, monotonous loop, generation after generation. There was no social mobility. You were born a serf, and you would die a serf. Your children would inherit your tools, your debts, and your obligations to the Lord. It's a stark reminder of how much we take our own freedoms for granted today. The ability to choose our path, to get an education, to move where we want, these were unimaginable luxuries for the vast majority of people for centuries. But here's the thing about the human spirit: it finds a way. Even in the bleakest of circumstances, families clung to each other. This shared struggle, this collective hardship, forged incredibly strong bonds. They were all in it together, facing the same injustices and the same fears. At night, huddled together in their small, smoky huts, they found ways to cope. They told stories passed down through generations, sang songs of heroes or of sorrow, and found small moments of laughter to light up the darkness. These simple acts of connection, of shared culture, were their resistance. It was how they remained human in a system that treated them like livestock. It didn't change their reality, but it made the crushing weight of that reality just a little more bearable. Thanks for sticking with me through that deep dive into the tough life of a serf. If you found this interesting and want to explore more hidden corners of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. We'll see you in the next one. Scene opens on a dimly lit, rustic setting. Maybe a crackling fireplace or candlelit desk. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back. Tonight I want to take you on a journey. Not to a grand castle or a glorious battlefield, but to the muddy, unforgiving fields of 14th century England. Let's talk about the people who worked those fields, the serfs. Their lives were a relentless cycle of hardship, bound not by chains, but by law and tradition to the land they tilled. They were, in essence, property. Imagine waking before the sun, your body already aching from yesterday's labor. Your world is small, confined to the village and the fields owned by your lord. You owe him your work, a portion of your harvest, and your unwavering obedience. Your children are born into this same life, their futures already written. This wasn't just a job. It was an inherited sentence. For generations, this was the unquestioned reality. But what happens when the weight of that reality becomes too much to bear? By the late 1300s, England was a pressure cooker. The Black Death had swept through a generation earlier, wiping out nearly half the population. This created a strange new reality. Labor was suddenly scarce and, for the first time, valuable. Peasants began to imagine a life with better wages, with more freedom. But the ruling class, the lords and nobles, weren't about to let their cheap labor force just walk away. They passed laws to freeze wages and lock people in place, tightening their grip just as the serfs began to see a glimmer of hope. Then came the final straw, a series of new, punishing taxes. The final one, a poll tax levied on every person over 15, was a breaking point. It didn't matter if you were a wealthy merchant or a starving peasant, you paid the same. For people who had nothing, this was an impossible demand. It was an insult layered on top of centuries of injury. The simmering resentment was about to boil over. Enough was finally enough. In the summer of 1381, the rebellion ignited. From the villages of Essex and Kent, thousands of common people rose up. They weren't a disorganized mob. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and priests, united by a shared sense of injustice. They marched under the leadership of figures like Wat Tyler, a charismatic and determined man who gave a voice to their demands, an end to serfdom, fair taxes, and justice from a system that had only ever oppressed them. They marched on London, their numbers swelling. They stormed the Tower of London, executing the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King's treasurer men they saw as the architects of their misery. For a moment it seemed like the world was turning upside down. The rebels met with the young King Richard II, who, seeing the sheer force of the crowd, made incredible promises. He agreed to all their demands. Freedom felt so close they could taste it, but it was a trap. During a second negotiation, Wat Tyler was struck down and killed. The rebellion lost its leader, its heart. Without him, the movement fractured. The king's promises evaporated. Royal armies were dispatched to the countryside, and a brutal crackdown began. The leaders were hunted down and executed, their heads displayed on spikes as a terrifying warning. The revolt was crushed, and the old order snapped back into place. Life, for the serfs, returned to the same grinding, muddy cycle. It's a tragic end to the story, isn't it? A failed rebellion. But history is more complicated than that. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 planted a seed. It showed the ruling class that the common people had a breaking point. The cracks in the foundation of serfdom had been exposed. Though the rebellion failed, the economic forces couldn't be stopped. The population was still low, labor was still in demand, and wages slowly, inevitably began to rise. Over the next century, serfdom didn't end because of a king's mercy or a change of heart. It withered away because it no longer made economic sense. Freedom arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, gradual shift in the balance of power. So, the next time you're having a rough day at the office or you feel stuck in a rut, take a moment. Remember the story of the serfs. Remember that the freedoms we often take for granted, the right to choose our work, to demand fair pay, to simply leave a job we don't like, were not given. They were fought for, bled for, and ultimately won through centuries of struggle. Our world is built on the echoes of their defiance. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more dives into the forgotten corners of history. Until next time, stay curious.